The suitcase was a soft burgundy color. I remember buying it years ago at a Macy's in downtown Cincinnati, on a trip with my husband Gerald before his knees gave out and travel became something we only talked about over dinner. It had gold zipper pulls and a small embroidered rose on the interior lining, a detail so delicate that I used to run my finger over it every time I packed, the way you touch something you love without thinking about it. I hadn't touched that suitcase in almost 3 years. So when my son David pulled it down from the hallway closet on a Tuesday morning in late February of 2025, I felt something small and hopeful stir inside my chest. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my second cup of coffee, the one I always let go slightly cold because I get distracted by the birds at the feeder outside the window. A fat cardinal had been coming every morning that week. I had named him Gerald, quietly, just to myself. "Mom," David said, setting the suitcase upright in the hallway with a soft thud. "I think it's time we got you somewhere you can really be taken care of." I looked at him over the rim of my cup. He was 51 years old. Playboy. The one I had labored with for 19 hours on a hot July night in 1973. The one whose nightmares I had chased away with warm milk and soft humming. The one I had driven to every baseball practice, every orthodontist appointment, every college orientation. I knew the shape of his shoulders before he was born. I had watched them move beneath my skin. "A trip?" I asked because that is what I wanted it to be. He didn't meet my eyes. He crouched beside the suitcase and unzipped it with a kind of practiced efficiency that told me he had already thought this through. Completely. Without me. "I've found a place," he said. "It's very nice, Mom. It's in Blue Ash. Good staff. Garden. You'll have your own room." I set my coffee cup down. The cardinal outside the window flew away. I want to tell you that I stood up and said something fierce, something that filled the room. I want to tell you that I was the kind of woman who throws open doors and demands to be heard. But I am 71 years old, and I have learned that silence is sometimes the only dignified response to a thing so ugly you cannot yet find words for it. So I sat. I folded my hands in my lap, the way my mother taught me, and I looked at my son as he began placing items into my suitcase. My cardigan. My Bible. The small framed photograph of Gerald and me on our wedding day, June 14, 1976, a Saturday warm and golden as bread from the oven. He was packing my life into a bag that held 40 liters. "David," I said very quietly, "have I done something wrong?" He paused for just a moment. Half-second. Then he kept folding. "It's not about that, Mom. It's about what's practical. You can't keep living alone in this house. You fell last month. I slipped on the porch step. Once. And you didn't tell anyone for 2 hours. Because I was fine. Because you're stubborn," he said. And the word came out with an edge I hadn't expected. Not frustrated. Not worried. Tired. As if I had been a burden he had been carrying so long the weight had turned into resentment without him even noticing. I looked around my kitchen. The yellow curtains I had sewn by hand in 1989. The copper pot hanging above the stove that Gerald's mother had given us. The small cactus on the windowsill my granddaughter Lily had painted a tiny face on with nail polish when she was 6. She was 16 now and had not visited in over a year. This was not a house. It was a life. 34 years of Saturday mornings, of birthday cakes, of arguments and reconciliations and quiet evenings. And my son was standing in the middle of it with his back half-turned, folding my cardigans. "When?" I asked. "Friday," he said. 3 days. Part 1 end. 3 days felt like a sentence handed down by a judge who hadn't even looked up from his papers. I didn't cry. Not in front of David. I had made myself that promise somewhere between the moment he said Friday and the moment he zipped the suitcase halfway shut, leaving it open like an unfinished thought in the middle of my hallway. I excused myself, told him I was going to lie down, and walked to my bedroom with the careful, measured steps of a woman who refuses to let anyone see her knees buckle. Closed the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my bed. Gerald's side, not mine, because I had never been able to fully claim the whole mattress after he passed. And I pressed my hands flat against the quilt. My mother had made this quilt. Dresden plate pattern, in blues and creams and one square of pale yellow that had always looked slightly out of place until Gerald told me it was his favorite piece because it was unexpected. Just like you, Ruthie, he had said. My name is Ruth Eleanor Calloway. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, in 1953. I taught elementary school for 26 years. I raised 2 children, buried a husband, survived a cancer scare at 63, and learned to live alone in a house full of memories without losing my mind. I am not a woman who needs to be managed. But sitting on that quilt, in the pale afternoon light of a February Tuesday, I felt something I had not felt since Gerald's last days in the hospital. Reducible. Like something that could be folded up and placed into a 40-liter suitcase without too much trouble. I heard David moving around in the kitchen. The scrape of a chair. The sound of him on the phone, his voice low and professional, the tone he used at work. I caught fragments. Yes, Friday morning. Yes, she's agreeable. Agreeable. As if we had discussed this. As if I had nodded and signed something. As if my silence in the kitchen had been consent rather than shock. I thought about calling my daughter Patricia. She lived in Nashville now, had for 12 years, with her second husband and his 2 teenage sons. Patricia and I spoke on Sundays reliably, though the calls had grown shorter over the years. She knew how to be warm without being present, a skill she had perfected so thoroughly I sometimes forgot to notice the distance until a moment like this one arrived. I picked up my phone and dialed her number. She answered on the 3rd ring, slightly breathless. Mom, I was just thinking about you. How's the cardinal? For a moment, the tenderness of that question, that she remembered the cardinal, that she had been listening last Sunday when I mentioned him, made my throat tighten. Patricia, I said. Your brother is putting me in a nursing home on Friday. Silence. Then, oh Mom, we've talked about this. And there it was. We've talked about this. Meaning she and David had talked about this. Meaning there had been a conversation, perhaps many conversations, in which the 2 of them had sat across from each other. Or more likely talked on the phone, Patricia's voice low so her husband wouldn't hear, and decided what to do with me. Like a piece of furniture that no longer matched the room. No, I said, keeping my voice even. You and David talked about this. I was not in that conversation. Mom, you slipped on the porch. Patricia, I need you to tell me honestly. Do you think this is right? Another silence. Longer this time. I could hear her breathing, and beneath that, the faint sound of a television somewhere in her Nashville house. I think, she said carefully, that David is doing what he thinks is best. And I think you deserve to be somewhere safe. Somewhere you're not alone. She meant it kindly. I know she did. Patricia has always been the one who means things kindly while still breaking your heart with them. I said, I see. We spoke for a few more minutes about nothing. The weather in Nashville, a recipe she tried, the cardinal. And then we said goodbye the way we always did, with warmth and vagueness, like 2 people waving to each other across a river neither one wants to swim. I set the phone on the nightstand. Outside my window, the light was beginning to go gold the way it does in late February in Ohio. Thin and watery. Beautiful in a way that always made me a little sad. I looked at the dresser. At the photograph of Gerald. At the small ceramic dish where I kept my rings when I washed dishes. I thought about Friday. And then, very quietly, I began to think about something else entirely. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the dark and listened to the house breathe. That is the only way I know how to describe it. A house breathes. It has its own rhythms, its own small sounds that you stop hearing after enough years because they become part of you. The tick of the baseboard heater in the hallway. The way the 3rd stair from the top creaks slightly to the left. The sound the kitchen window makes when the wind comes from the north. A faint whistle through the old weather stripping that Gerald had promised to fix every winter for 15 years and never did. and that I had never fixed after he was gone because I had grown to love it. I lay there and I listened to all of it. And I thought about what thinking about something else entirely actually meant. I am not an impulsive woman. I never have been. Even as a young teacher standing in front of 32nd graders, I had learned that the most powerful thing you can do in a chaotic room is go still. Stop raising your voice. Stop reacting. Just go quiet and steady and wait and watch and think. The children always noticed. The room always settled. And then you could move. I had been still all Tuesday afternoon. All through dinner, which David made. Spaghetti from a jar, which he set in front of me with a guilty, slightly over-cheerful manner of a man who knows he has done something terrible and is hoping food will cover it. I thanked him. I asked about his work, about his wife Sandra, about their son Marcus who was applying to colleges. I was pleasant. I was warm. I was, to all appearances, a 71-year-old woman who had accepted her circumstances. I had not accepted anything. By Wednesday morning I had a list. Not written down. I have never needed to write things down to remember them. Gerald used to say my mind was a filing cabinet. Organized, reliable, nothing misfiled. 26 years of teaching had given me that. You learn to hold 30 names, 30 reading levels, 30 sets of parents' expectations in your head simultaneously. And you learn to do it calmly. My list had 4 items. The first was Margaret Osei. Margaret was my attorney. She had been my attorney for 11 years, since she helped me set up Gerald's estate after he passed. She was 63, sharp as a tack, and she had a voice that could silence a room without effort. I had her personal cell number in my phone, not just her office line. The second was First Federal Bank on Montgomery Road. I had 3 accounts there. Checking account, a savings account that David did not know the full balance of, and a third account, a small certificate of deposit that Gerald and I had opened in 1999 and rolled over every 5 years, quietly without fanfare, the way we did most things. The third item was the house itself. 4412 Cloverdale Drive, Cincinnati, Ohio. Purchased in 1991. Paid off in 2014. Gerald's name and my name, and then only my name on the deed. My house. Name. My 34 years. The fourth item was the most important and the most tender, and I let myself sit with it for a long time before I moved on. It was a name. James Whitfield. Gerald's younger brother. A retired civil engineer who lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, a man I had spoken to perhaps a dozen times in the past 3 years, always briefly, always warmly, always with the particular affection of 2 people who share a grief that binds them. James had called me on my birthday in September. He had sent a Christmas card with a handwritten note that said, "Ruth, if you ever need anything, and I mean anything, please call me." I had tucked the card into the drawer of my nightstand. I still had it. I got up at 6 in the morning before David was awake. I made my coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and I watched the feeder, and Gerald the Cardinal came at 6:17, same as always, and sat on the thin metal perch and ate sunflower seeds with an air of complete self-possession. I envied him that. I picked up my phone and I called Margaret Osei. She answered on the second ring because Margaret Osei has always answered on the second ring. "Ruth," she said, and her voice was warm and alert. "What's happened?" I told her. All of it. Calmly, in order, without editorializing. The suitcase. The phrase "somewhere you can really be taken care of." The phone call with Patricia. The word "agreeable." When I finished, there was a brief silence. "Are you in any immediate danger?" she asked first. Always the attorney. "No," I said. "I am in my kitchen drinking coffee." "Good. Can you come to my office today?" "David took my car keys last night," I said. "He said he'd drive me wherever I needed to go." Another silence. This one with a different texture. "Ruth," Margaret said, "don't tell David where you're going. Call a cab. Or use one of those apps. I'll walk you through it if you need. Come to my office at 10 o'clock this morning." I looked at the cardinal. He flew away without looking back, unbothered, uncontained, going exactly where he intended to go. "I'll be there at 10, I said. I had not used a rideshare app in my life. My granddaughter Lily had shown me once, 2 summers ago, tapping through the screens on my phone with the casual speed of a generation that had grown up speaking the language of technology like a mother tongue. I had watched and nodded and promptly forgotten, because at the time I hadn't needed it. Had my car. A 2019 silver Honda Accord that I kept clean and filled and had driven without incident for 6 years. David had placed my keys on the kitchen counter Tuesday evening with a quietness that was meant to look casual. I had watched him do it from the corner of my eye. He had not said a word about it. Neither had I. We had simply entered a new arrangement, unspoken, the way families sometimes do. The shift in power disguised as concern, the control dressed up in the language of care. Wednesday morning, while David slept, I sat at my kitchen table and I figured out the app. Took me 22 minutes. I will not pretend otherwise. I had to reset my password, and then I had to find my reading glasses. And then I had to squint at the small print that told me a driver named Carlos in a gray Toyota Camry was 4 minutes away. But I did it. Alone in my kitchen at 6:40 in the morning, with cold coffee and a cardinal for company. I left David a note on the counter. Said gone out for a bit. Back before lunch. Polite. Unrevealing. The kind of note a woman leaves when she has somewhere to be and no intention of explaining herself. Margaret's office was in Hyde Park, on Erie Avenue, in a 2-story brick building with white window boxes that she filled with red geraniums every spring. I had always liked that about her, that a woman so precise and formidable would bother with geraniums. It said something about the fullness of a person. She was waiting for me in her office when I arrived, standing near the window with a legal pad already open on her desk and 2 cups of coffee on the table between the chairs. She embraced me when I came in, briefly and firmly, the way capable women embrace each other. Not lingering, not performative, just real. "Sit," she said. Sat. She asked me several questions in the careful, methodical way of someone building something solid. Who had power of attorney currently? Whether I had ever signed any documents designating David as a decision-maker for my healthcare or finances. Whether I had been diagnosed with any condition, cognitive, physical, that had been documented by a physician in a formal capacity. The answer to all 3 was no. I had never given David power of attorney. I had never signed any healthcare proxy naming him. My doctor, a kind woman named Dr. Anita Patel at a practice in Kenwood, had noted my slip on the porch step in my file. At David's insistence, he had called her office, but there had been no formal evaluation, no diagnosis, no finding of incapacity. David had no legal authority over me whatsoever. I watched Margaret write this down, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not rage. Not triumph. Something quieter than both. The particular steadiness of a woman who has just remembered exactly where she stands. "Ruth," Margaret said, setting her pen down and looking at me directly. "No one can force you into a care facility without either your consent or a court order establishing legal incapacity. David has neither. If he attempts to place you somewhere against your will, that is, at minimum, unlawful restraint. Potentially elder abuse under Ohio statute." I let that sit in the room for a moment. "He doesn't know that," I said. "No," Margaret said. "He probably doesn't." "And Sandra?" Yes. David's wife. A woman I had tried to love for 23 years with varying degrees of success. A woman who had always been polite to my face, and whom I suspected had been the architect of more than one decision that had David's name on the front of it. Margaret tilted her head slightly. "What about Sandra?" "She works in healthcare administration," I said. "She knows facilities. She would have been the one to find this place in Blue Ash. She would have made the calls. She would have done the paperwork." Margaret looked at me with the particular expression of an attorney who has just been handed a piece of information she finds useful. Then Sandra knows how these placements work, she said carefully. Which means Sandra knows what documentation is required. And the fact that they moved forward without it tells me one of two things. Either they assumed you would simply comply, or they believed the paperwork could be handled after the fact. I thought about the word David had used on the phone. Agreeable. They assumed I would comply, I said. Margaret nodded slowly. Then she picked up her pen again. Then let's make sure Friday looks very different from what they're expecting, she said. And we began. There is a particular kind of power that comes not from raising your voice but from knowing something the other person does not know you know. I had spent 26 years in a classroom understanding this. A teacher who loses her composure loses the room. But a teacher who stays calm, who watches, who waits, she keeps everything. I rode back to Cloverdale Drive in another gray Camry. A different driver this time. A quiet older man named Raymond who had a small wooden cross hanging from his rearview mirror and gospel music playing so softly it was almost below hearing. I sat in the back seat and watched Cincinnati move past the window. The bare February trees lining Madison Road. The coffee shops just opening, their windows fogged with warmth. The ordinary Wednesday morning life of a city that did not know or care that a 71-year-old woman in the back of a Camry was quietly rearranging everything. Margaret and I had spent 2 hours together. When I left her office, I had 3 things I had not walked in with. The first was clarity. A thorough, documented understanding of my legal standing. My rights as a competent adult. The specific Ohio statutes that protected elderly individuals from involuntary placement. Margaret had printed them out and tucked them into a plain manila envelope that I slid into my purse between my checkbook and my rosary. The second was an appointment. Dr. Anita Patel's office had agreed to see me that same afternoon at 2 o'clock. Margaret had made the call herself while I sat across from her. A formal cognitive and physical wellness evaluation. Documented, signed, placed in my medical file. Evidence, if evidence was ever needed, that Ruth Eleanor Calloway was in full possession of her faculties and her freedom. The third thing was harder to name. It was something internal. A decision fully made, that had been half-formed since Tuesday morning but was now solid and clean-edged as a stone in my hand. I had decided not to confront David. Not yet. Not loudly. I was going to let Friday come. And I was going to let David believe, right up until the moment it mattered, that I was still the agreeable mother in the kitchen with her cold coffee and her birds. I got home at 11:15. David's car was in the driveway. I went inside and found him at the kitchen table with his laptop open, still in the clothes he'd slept in, a half-eaten bowl of cereal in front of him. He looked up when I came in and a flash of something, not quite guilt, not quite relief, moved across his face. "Where'd you go?" he asked. Casual. Controlled. "Walked down to the pharmacy," I said. "I needed a few things." He looked at my hands. I was not carrying a pharmacy bag. Had thought of this. I had stopped at a Walgreens 2 blocks from home and bought a small bottle of hand lotion and a pack of peppermint gum, which were now in my coat pocket. I set them on the counter. He looked back at his laptop. "You should have told me. I would have driven you." "I know," I said. "But it was a nice morning and I wanted the air." I made myself a fresh cup of coffee and I sat at the table across from him. And we had the most ordinary conversation. I asked about Marcus's college applications again. He told me about a university in Michigan that Marcus was considering. He told me Sandra was thinking about repainting the living room. I listened and nodded and refilled my cup and said all the right things in all the right places. And the whole time, beneath every word, I was somewhere else entirely. I was thinking about the phone call I needed to make that evening to James Whitfield in Scottsdale. I was thinking about the second appointment Margaret had scheduled for Thursday morning. Not medical this time, but financial. A meeting with my advisor at First Federal. I was thinking about the house. About what it meant. About what I intended to do with it and when and how. At 2 o'clock I told David I had a doctor's appointment. He immediately reached for his keys. "I'll take you. It's just a routine check," I said. "My friend Eleanor is picking me up. We're going to get lunch after." Eleanor Marsh was my oldest friend in Cincinnati. We had taught at the same elementary school for 14 years. She was 74, still sharp, still funny, and she would have driven me to the moon and back without asking a single unnecessary question. I had texted her from the Camry on the way home. She had replied with 3 words. "On my way, honey." David hesitated. He was calculating something. I could see it in the slight tension at the corners of his eyes, the look of a man who is trying to maintain control without appearing to be controlling. "Okay," he finally said. "Text me when you're heading back." "Of course," I said. Eleanor arrived at 1:45 in her white Buick. Her silver hair pinned up the way she'd worn it for 40 years. Her reading glasses pushed to the top of her head. She embraced me on the porch and said nothing about where we were going or why, because Eleanor Marsh has always understood that some things are conveyed in a phone call and honored in person without requiring further explanation. In the car, she reached over and patted my hand once. "You tell me what you need," she said. "Right now," I said. "I just need someone to drive." She nodded and pulled out of the driveway, and I looked at my house through the passenger window as we moved away from it, the yellow curtains just visible through the front glass, the bare oak tree in the yard that Gerald had planted from a sapling in 1993, the porch step that David had used as evidence of my decline. I memorized it, the way you memorize something you're not going to lose. Dr. Anita Patel had kind eyes and careful hands, and the particular gift of making a patient feel seen rather than examined. I had been coming to her practice for 9 years, since she had taken over from my previous doctor who retired to Sarasota, and in that time she had learned the difference between my worried face and my thinking face. She looked at me across the examination table on Wednesday afternoon and she said, "Ruth, what's actually going on?" I told her. All of it. The same way I had told Margaret, calmly, in order, without embellishment. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer in a physician than it should be. And when I finished she was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who is choosing her words with genuine care. "Has David contacted this office?" I asked because I needed to know. He paused. "Just briefly." "He called last month after your fall. He expressed concern and asked that any incidents be documented." "Did he ask for copies of my records?" "He requested them," she said carefully. "We informed him that without a signed release from you, we could not provide them." I nodded slowly. So he had tried. He had been building something quietly, the same way I was building something now, except that he had assumed I would never know to look. "Anita," I said, using her first name the way I rarely did, "I need a full evaluation today. Cognitive, physical, the works. I need it documented thoroughly, and I need a copy from my attorney." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "I'll have my nurse bring in the full assessment forms." The evaluation took nearly an hour. Memory tests, reflex tests, balance assessments, blood pressure, a brief depression screening that I answered with the careful honesty of a woman who knows the difference between sadness and illness. I was sad. I was not ill. There is a profound difference and I needed it on record. When it was done, Dr. Patel sat across from me and told me what I already knew. My blood pressure was slightly elevated, understandably given the circumstances. My cognitive scores were well within normal range. My balance was good. My reflexes were appropriate for my age. I was, in the clinical language of medicine, a healthy 71-year-old woman with full decision-making capacity. She printed 2 copies of the report, one for my file, one for my purse, slipped into the manila envelope beside the Ohio statutes Margaret had given me. Eleanor was waiting in the parking lot with the Buick running and 2 cups of coffee from the drive-thru in the cup holder. I got in and she handed me mine without a word, and we sat for a moment in the parking lot of the medical building on Kenwood Road while the February afternoon went gray around us. "Well," she said. "Healthy as a horse," I said. Documented. Eleanor made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. Good, she said. Then, are you going to tell me what the full plan is? I wrapped both hands around the warm coffee cup. Outside, a few dry leaves skittered across the parking lot asphalt, moving fast and purposeful in the wind, going somewhere. Thursday morning I have a meeting at First Federal, I said. I need to restructure a few things. Counts, beneficiaries, a couple of other matters. Eleanor was quiet, listening. And Thursday evening, I said, I'm going to call James. She knew who James was. I had mentioned him over the years. Gerald's brother, the engineer in Scottsdale, the one who sent Christmas cards with handwritten notes. Eleanor had met him once, briefly, at Gerald's funeral, and had said afterward that he had Gerald's eyes and a steadier version of Gerald's smile. What are you going to ask him? She said. I took a sip of coffee. I'm going to ask him if the offer still stands. Eleanor nodded. She did not ask what offer. She trusted that I knew what I was doing, which is the gift of a friendship long enough to have moved past the need to explain yourself at every turn. We drove back to Cloverdale Drive through the early dark of the February evening. The streetlights were coming on, one by one, along Madison Road. I watched them appear in sequence, steady and reliable, illuminating small circles of ordinary life. A man walking a dog, a woman unloading groceries, two children on a porch bundled in winter coats, doing nothing in particular. David's car was still in the driveway when Eleanor pulled up. She put the car in park and turned to look at me, and in the dim light from the dashboard her face was the face of the woman I had known for 41 years, the one who had held my hand in the hospital when Gerald was in surgery, who had shown up at my door 3 days after his funeral with a casserole and a bottle of wine and the good sense to stay through both. Do you want me to come in with you? She said. No, I said. I need to go in there alone. I need him to keep thinking I'm just his mother who had a routine appointment and got lunch with a friend. Eleanor looked at me steadily. And what are you actually? I picked up my purse, the one with the manila envelope inside, the one with the legal statutes and the medical report and the rosary and the Christmas card from James that I had tucked in that morning before I left, as a kind of talisman. I'm a woman who has 3 days to finish what I started, I said. I went inside. David looked up from the couch, where he was watching the news with the sound low. Good appointment, he asked. Routine, I said pleasantly. Everything's fine. I hung up my coat. I went to the kitchen and started a pot of soup from scratch. Chicken and vegetables, Gerald's recipe, the one I made when I needed to feel rooted in something real. I stood at the stove and I stirred and I listened to the house breathe around me. And I let David believe that nothing had changed since Tuesday morning. Nothing except everything. Thursday morning arrived the way significant days sometimes do. Quietly, without ceremony, as if the world had not been informed of its own importance. I was up at 5:30. I made my coffee, I fed the cardinal, and I sat at my kitchen table in the gray pre-dawn light and I wrote a letter. Not to David. Not to Patricia. Not to anyone who had hurt me or failed me or folded my cardigans into a 40-liter suitcase with the brisk efficiency of someone disposing of something inconvenient. I wrote it to Gerald. I do this sometimes, when something large is happening and I need to think it through out loud but do not want an audience. I write to him the way some people pray, not expecting an answer, not even certain of who receives the words, but trusting that the act of writing them matters. That the honesty of them matters. I told him about the suitcase. About David's voice when he said the word practical. About Patricia on the phone saying, I think you deserve to be somewhere safe, in the tone of a woman who has already made her peace with a decision she knows is wrong. I told him about Margaret and Dr. Patel and Eleanor and the manila envelope in my purse. I told him I was frightened. Not of the nursing home, not exactly, but of what it meant that my children had looked at my life and seen something to be managed rather than respected. And then I told him what I was going to do about it. When I finished, I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer of my nightstand, on top of the Christmas card from James. I got dressed. Navy slacks, my good cream blouse, the small pearl earrings Gerald had given me for our 25th anniversary. I wanted to look like exactly what I was. A woman of substance. A woman who had somewhere important to be. David came downstairs at 7:15 to find me at the table, dressed and ready. "You're up early," he said, moving toward the coffee maker. "I have an errand this morning," I said. "Eleanor is picking me up at 8. He turned slightly. "Another errand?" "Just some banking," I said. "I've been meaning to update some paperwork for months. You know how I am about putting things off." It was a masterful sentence, that last one. You know how I am about putting things off. It confirmed every assumption he had already made about me, that I was slow, behind, in need of nudging. It made the banking sound like something routine and overdue rather than something precise and intentional. He turned back to his coffee. "Okay. Do you want me to?" "Eleanor's already coming," I said warmly. "But thank you, sweetheart." I had not called him sweetheart in years. I said it deliberately, gently, like placing a hand on someone's shoulder to keep them still. Eleanor arrived at 8 on the dot. We were at First Federal on Montgomery Road by 8:20, and my advisor, a careful, methodical man named Robert Huang who had managed my accounts for 7 years, was waiting for us in his office with the door closed. I had called Robert from Eleanor's car the previous afternoon and told him I needed to review and potentially restructure several aspects of my accounts. He had not asked unnecessary questions. He had simply said, "I'll have everything pulled up when you arrive." We spent 90 minutes in that office. I will not detail every transaction, every form, every quiet legal adjustment that took place in that room with its framed diplomas and its view of the Montgomery Road traffic and its small dish of wrapped peppermints on the corner of the desk. Some things do not need to be described in full to be understood. What I will tell you is this. When I walked out of First Federal Bank at 9:50 on that Thursday morning, the financial architecture of my life looked substantially different than it had when I walked in. Beneficiaries had been reviewed and in certain cases revised. A specific account, the certificate of deposit that Gerald and I had opened in 1999, rolled over quietly every 5 years, the one David did not know the full balance of, had been restructured in a way that made its disposition entirely clear and entirely mine. And a conversation had been had, documented in Robert's notes, about the potential future establishment of a trust. A conversation that Margaret would follow up on the following week. In the car afterward, Eleanor said nothing for a full minute. Then she said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it genuinely. "Like myself," I said. "For the first time since Tuesday." We stopped for breakfast at a small diner on Erie Avenue that Eleanor and I had been going to for 15 years. We ordered the same things we always ordered: scrambled eggs and wheat toast for me, oatmeal with brown sugar for Eleanor, and we sat by the window and watched the morning happen outside on the street, and we talked about ordinary things. A book Eleanor was reading. The tulip bulbs she had planted in the fall. A funny thing her grandson had said on the phone last weekend. We did not talk about David or Patricia or nursing homes or Friday. We did not need to. That part of the morning was done. And this part, eggs and toast and a friend and a window and the ordinary grace of a Thursday that was still mine, this part deserved to be itself, uncomplicated and whole. Got home at noon. David was on a work call in the living room, pacing in the way he always paced when he was on calls, a habit he'd had since college. He waved at me through the doorway. I waved back and went to the kitchen and made a sandwich and sat at my table. At 1 o'clock I went to my bedroom and I closed the door and I picked up my phone and I dialed James Whitfield in Scottsdale, Arizona. He answered on the second ring. "Ruth," he said, and his voice was warm and unhurried. The voice of a man who has spent a lifetime in the desert and acquired its particular quality of stillness. "I was hoping you'd call." "Were you?" I said. "Gerald always said you'd land on your feet no matter what," he said. "But he also said you were too proud to ask for help when you needed it. So I figured when you called, it would mean something." My throat tightened in a way I had not allowed it to all week. "James," I said. "I need to ask you something." "Ask," he said simply. And so I did. James Whitfield had retired from civil engineering at 67 after 40 years of building things meant to last. Bridges mostly. Infrastructure. The kind of work that requires you to think not just about what something looks like today but about what it will bear 20, 30, 50 years from now. He had told me this once, years ago at a family gathering, and I had thought at the time that it explained something essential about the man. The way he listened before he spoke, the way he considered weight and load and duration before committing to anything. He listened to everything I said without interrupting once. I told him about the suitcase. About blue ash. About David's voice and Patricia's careful neutrality, and the word agreeable on a phone call I was never supposed to hear. I told him about Margaret and Dr. Patel and First Federal and the manila envelope. I told him I was not calling because I was broken or frightened or in need of rescue. I was calling because Gerald's brother had written "if you ever need anything" on a Christmas card and meant it. And because I was a woman who had spent a week learning to ask for what she needed instead of waiting for someone to offer. When I finished, James was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is full rather than empty. "Ruth," he said. "Gerald used to say the two smartest decisions he ever made were planting that oak tree and marrying you. In that order, because he said the tree was less likely to argue with him." A sound came out of me that surprised me. It was almost a laugh. The first one in days. "He wasn't wrong," I said. "I have a guest house," James said. "It's separate from the main house. Has its own entrance, its own kitchen, its own everything. I had it built 3 years ago when I thought my daughter might move back from Portland. She didn't, of course, because children make their own decisions regardless of what we build for them." Brief dry pause. "It's been sitting empty since last April." I pressed my hand flat against the quilt on Gerald's side of the bed. "I don't want to impose, James." "Ruth." His voice was patient and firm in equal measure. "You are Gerald's wife. You are family. And from what you've just told me, you are also a woman who has done everything right this week and deserves somewhere to land that is entirely on her own terms. This is not an imposition. This is me honoring a man I loved by taking care of the person he loved most." I did not trust myself to speak for a moment. "Scottsdale," I finally said. "I've never lived anywhere but Ohio." "You haven't lived anywhere but Ohio," he agreed. "But you've also never been dropped off at a nursing home. And here we are, considering new experiences." That time I did laugh. Fully. It moved through me like something being released. We talked for another 40 minutes. Practical things, careful things, the logistics of a move, the timeline, what I would need and what he already had. James spoke about Scottsdale the way a man speaks about a place that has healed him. The light, the dry air, the mountains that turn amber and rose at sunset, the way the silence, there is a different quality of silence than the silence of an Ohio winter. He spoke about it without overselling, without pressure. Simply describing it the way you describe something you love to someone you think might love it too. By the time we said goodbye, we had the outline of something real. I sat with the phone in my lap for a long time after we hung up. The afternoon light was doing its thin February thing through the curtains, and the house was quiet, and somewhere in the walls the baseboard heater was ticking its familiar tick. And I thought about 34 years on Cloverdale Drive with a fullness in my chest that was not grief exactly but was related to it. The particular ache of loving something you are choosing to leave before it is taken from you. 'Cause that was the thing. That was what had clarified itself over the course of this week. In Margaret's office and Dr. Patel's examination room and First Federal Bank and a diner on Erie Avenue. In a Camry with gospel music and a parking lot with blowing leaves and 40 minutes on the phone with a civil engineer in the Arizona desert. I was not going to let them take this from me. I was going to leave. On my own terms. In my own time. To a place I had chosen, with a person who had offered freely. Toward a life that still had shape and dignity and forward motion. I was going to leave first. Friday was tomorrow. David expected to load me and my burgundy suitcase into his car and drive me to a facility in Blue Ash where someone else had decided I belonged. He had made appointments. He had, I suspected, already paid a deposit. He had built the whole architecture of Friday without consulting the person Friday was happening to. And so I spent Thursday evening dismantling it. Not loudly. Not dramatically. I made dinner. Roasted chicken, roasted carrots, the good crusty bread from the bakery on Marburg Avenue. I set the table properly, the way I always did, with placemats and cloth napkins and the small ceramic salt dish shaped like an owl that had lived on my table for 20 years. I lit a candle. David came to the table looking slightly surprised by the formality of it. "Special occasion," he said, attempting lightness. "I just felt like a proper dinner," I said. "We." I asked about Marcus again. Had he heard back from Michigan? David said not yet, maybe next week. I told him to tell Marcus that wherever he went, to choose the place that felt like it had room for who he was still becoming. David looked at me with a slight furrowing of the brow, as if he wasn't sure whether there was something underneath that or not. There was. But it wasn't for him. It was for Marcus, who was 17 and had his whole life ahead of him, and deserved a grandmother who understood what it meant to choose your own direction. After dinner I washed the dishes by hand, the way I always preferred, and I dried them and put them away in their places. I wiped down the counter. I turned off the kitchen light. Then I went to my bedroom and I began to pack. Not the burgundy suitcase. David had packed that one. I went to the top shelf of my closet and I took down a different bag. A large navy duffel that I had bought for a church retreat years ago and that David had never seen and would not recognize. I packed it with the things that mattered. Not all of them. Some things would be shipped, some things would wait, some things belonged to the house and could stay with it. But the things that were irreplaceable. Quilt. The framed photograph of Gerald and me. June 14, 1976. The ceramic owl. The letters I had saved in a shoebox for 30 years. The small cactus with the nail polish face that Lily had made when she was 6. I packed carefully, quietly, the way you pack when you know exactly where you are going. Friday arrived without drama. That is the thing about significant mornings. They do not announce themselves with thunder or changed light. They come in exactly like every other morning, the same gray pre-dawn, the same baseboard heater ticking, the same cardinal at the feeder at 6:17, as if the world had agreed to hold its ordinary shape right up until the moment it didn't. I was dressed by 6. Navy slacks again. My good cream blouse again. The pearl earrings. I had slept better Thursday night than I had slept all week, which surprised me at first and then didn't, because I have learned over 71 years that anxiety lives in uncertainty and peace lives in decision. I had decided. I had slept. The navy duffel was in my closet, zipped and ready, behind the hanging coats where David would not see it unless he was specifically looking. The burgundy suitcase sat in the hallway where David had left it, still half packed with the things he had chosen. The cardigans, the Bible, the photograph. I had quietly removed the photograph Tuesday night while David slept and placed it in the duffel. A small act of reclamation that had felt enormous in the dark. I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window and I watched Gerald the Cardinal arrive at 6:17, same as always, and I thought about the fact that this was the last morning I would watch him from this window. I had thought about this moment several times in the past 2 days and had expected it to undo me. Did not. It settled into me instead, the way true things do when you have made your peace with them. Not painlessly but cleanly. Eleanor was coming at 7:30. Not to the front door, which David would see, but to the alley behind the house, which connected to the back gate of the yard. We had arranged this Thursday afternoon in a series of text messages that I had deleted afterward, not out of deception exactly but out of the understanding that some exits are private by nature and do not require an audience. At 7 o'clock David came downstairs. He was dressed and alert in the way of a man who has an agenda for the day, who has organized himself around a task he believes is already accomplished. He looked at me at the kitchen table and said, "How are you feeling this morning, Mom?" "Fine," I said. "Would you like eggs?" He blinked, slightly thrown by the normalcy of it. "Sure," he said. "We made eggs." Scrambled, the way he had always liked them, with a little cream and a little butter the way I had made them since he was 7 years old, sitting at this same table in footy pajamas with his hair going in 7 directions. I set the plate in front of him and I sat across from him with my coffee, and I watched my son eat breakfast in my kitchen on the last morning I would make him breakfast in it. He ate quickly, the way he always did when he had somewhere to be. He checked his phone twice. He said something about what time they were expected at the facility. 10 o'clock, he said. They had a meeting with the intake coordinator at 10. He said it in the matter-of-fact tone of a man reciting logistics, and I listened and nodded and said nothing at all. At 7:15 I excused myself to get my coat. I went to my bedroom. I took the navy duffel from behind the coats. I stood for a moment in the doorway of my bedroom and I looked at it. The quilt on the bed, Gerald's side and mine, the dresser with a small ceramic dish where my rings lived when I washed dishes, the curtains I had never gotten around to replacing even though I had thought about it every spring for a decade. I did not try to memorize it this time. I had already done that. Instead, I simply stood in it for one more moment, the way you stand in sunlight when you know a cloud is coming. Not to stop anything, just to be fully present while it lasts. Then I picked up the duffel and I walked through my house. Through the hallway with the photographs. David and Patricia as children, Gerald and me at Niagara Falls in 1982, the whole family at Christmas 1998 when everyone was still young enough and close enough to stand together without it requiring negotiation. Through the living room with the blue armchair that had been Gerald's and that I had never moved an inch from the spot where he had last sat in it. Through the kitchen where the copper pot hung above the stove and the small cactus with a nail polish face sat on the windowsill, and the yellow curtains hung in the thin winter light. I stopped at the kitchen counter. I took out a plain white envelope that I had prepared the previous evening. I placed it on the counter in the center where it could not be missed. David's name was written on the front in my handwriting. Clear, unhurried. The handwriting of a woman who had written 30 years of lesson plans and report cards and birthday cards and grocery lists and one letter to a dead man on a Thursday morning before dawn. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. Not long. I am not a woman who needs many words when a few will do. I walked to the back door. I unlocked it quietly. The cold February air came in sharp and clean, the kind of cold that makes everything feel precise. I stepped out onto the back porch, the one with the step David had cited as evidence of my decline, and I walked carefully and steadily down it, the way a woman walks when she is paying attention to where she is going and is not afraid of where she has been. Eleanor was at the back gate in the white Buick with the engine running and the heat on. I could see the small cloud of exhaust rising soft and white in the cold air. She got out when she saw me and came around to take the duffel without being asked, the way she has always done things. Quietly, practically, without requiring recognition for it. I took one look back at the house. The back of it. The yard with Gerald's oak tree, bare and enormous against the white February sky, its branches holding their complex pattern of crossings and connections against the light the way they always had, the way they always would, long after any of us were here to stand beneath them. "Ready?" Eleanor said softly. I turned away from the tree. "Yes," I said. We got in the car. Eleanor pulled out of the alley onto the side street and then onto Madison Road heading toward the highway. And my house on Cloverdale Drive disappeared behind us in the way that things disappear when you are moving forward and not looking back. Gradually, then completely, then only present as something you carry inside you. Inside the envelope on the kitchen counter, my letter to David said this. David, love you. I have always loved you and I always will, the way a mother loves. Without condition and without end, even when it hurts. But I am not agreeable. I am your mother. I am 71 years old, I am healthy, I am capable. And I am leaving on my own terms to a place I have chosen for reasons that are mine. The house is mine. My life is mine. When you are ready to speak to me as the person I am rather than the problem you have decided I am, I will be ready to listen. Until then, please water the cactus on the windowsill. Lily made it for me and I am not ready to let it go yet either. All my love always, Mom. Scottsdale in March is a different world entirely. I had known this in the abstract, the way you know things you have only read about or seen in photographs. The desert light, the saguaro cacti standing at attention along the roadsides like ancient sentinels, the mountains that ring the city in shades of rust and ochre, and a particular dusty purple that I had no name for until I saw it with my own eyes and decided it was the color of patience. I had known all of this the way you know something before it becomes real. And then the plane descended through cloudless blue on a Sunday afternoon in early March, and I pressed my face close to the oval window like a child, and the city appeared below me, sprawling and sun-drenched and completely indifferent to my history, and something in my chest opened like a window that had been painted shut for years. James was waiting at baggage claim. He was 74, lean and straight-backed with Gerald's eyes and the weathered complexion of a man who had spent decades working outdoors. He was holding a small handwritten sign that said Ruth Eleanor Calloway in capital letters, and when I saw it I stopped walking for just a moment because the formality of it. My full name, all 3 parts, written in careful block letters by a man who wanted to make sure I felt found, did something to me that I was not entirely prepared for. I had not cried all week. Not once. Not in the kitchen on Tuesday morning. Not in Margaret's office. Not in the back of the Camry with the gospel music. Not walking out my back door on Friday morning with the cold February air on my face and my whole life in a navy duffel. I cried in the baggage claim of Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport on a Sunday afternoon in March, standing between a family with 4 small children and a businessman on his phone, while a 74-year-old civil engineer held up a handwritten sign with my name on it. James saw me and put the sign down and crossed the distance between us in a few strides and said absolutely nothing, which was exactly right, because there was nothing to say and he was wise enough to know it. He simply stood there while I collected myself, with a particular steady patience of a man who has spent a lifetime calculating how much weight a structure can bear. "Okay," I said finally, pressing my hands flat against my cheeks the way my mother used to do when she was resetting herself. "Okay. Let's go. Your bag is on carousel 3, he said. "How do you know which one is mine?" "Gerald told me once that you had a burgundy suitcase with gold zipper pulls that you bought at a Macy's in Cincinnati," he said. He mentioned it like it was something he was proud of. I never forgot it. I looked at him. "He talked about me," I said. "Not a question." "Ruth," James said, picking up the navy duffel from beside my feet and starting toward the carousel, "Gerald talked about you the way some men talk about the mountains. Like you were just part of the landscape of everything good." The guest house was small and perfect and full of light. It sat behind James's main house, connected by a path of flat river stones through a garden of desert plants, aloe and brittlebush, and a large palo verde tree whose branches were just beginning to show their first pale yellow blooms against the March sky. The guest house had its own entrance, its own kitchen with a window above the sink that looked out toward the McDowell Mountains, its own small sitting room with 2 chairs and a reading lamp and a bookshelf that James had stocked with novels, a gesture so thoughtful and specific that I stood in front of it for a long time just looking. He had put fresh flowers on the table. White daisies in a blue glass vase. I set the cactus with the nail polish face on the kitchen windowsill, in the sun. It looked right there. Lily's little painted face catching the desert light, cheerful and improbable and entirely itself. The first week was quiet. Deliberately, beautifully quiet. James and I had coffee in the mornings. He on his porch, me on mine, sometimes calling across the garden to each other, sometimes simply existing in comfortable parallel silence. He showed me the neighborhood, the trails, the farmer's market on Saturday mornings where a woman sold honey from her own hives and a man played Spanish guitar in the shade of a canvas awning. He did not rush me. He did not manage me. He treated me like a person who was capable of finding her own pace, which was the most generous thing anyone had done for me in longer than I wanted to admit. I called Eleanor every other day. She told me that David had called her the morning of my departure. His voice tight and controlled, asking if she knew where I had gone. She had told him that I was safe and that I would be in touch when I was ready, which was the truth and all he was entitled to. He had called twice more that week. She had said the same thing both times. Patricia had texted me on Saturday. The message said, "Mom, please just let us know you're okay. We're worried." I had read it 3 times. Then I had typed back, "I'm well, Patricia. I'm somewhere I chose. I'll call when I'm ready." I had sent it and set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and gone to stand at the window and look at the mountains until the tightness in my throat settled. I was not ready to speak to either of them yet. Not out of bitterness, I want to be clear about that, because bitterness is a thing I have always refused to carry, having watched what it did to people who could not put it down. I was not ready because some conversations require you to be fully standing before you have them, and I was still, in those first quiet weeks in the desert, finding my footing on new ground. By April I had found a routine. Morning coffee at the kitchen window, watching the light change on the McDowell Mountains. A walk along the trail behind the neighborhood, where the saguaros cast long shadows in the early morning, and the desert smelled of something clean and ancient that I had no name for either. Afternoons reading or writing or sitting in the garden with James while he told me about bridges. The physics of them, the poetry of them, the way a well-built bridge does not fight the forces working against it but instead distributes them, finds equilibrium, holds. I thought about that often. In the middle of April, on a warm Thursday evening when the desert sky was doing the thing it does at sunset that no photograph has ever adequately captured, I called David. He answered immediately. His voice when he said "Mom" had something in it I had not heard in years. Not the tired efficiency of a man managing a situation. Something rawer and younger. Something that sounded, if I am honest, like the boy I had driven to baseball practice and orthodontist appointments and college orientation. Like the boy whose nightmares I had chased away with warm milk and soft humming. "I'm in Scottsdale," I told him. "I'm well. I'm living in a guest house that belongs to your Uncle James. And I have more peace than I have known in a very long time." A long silence. "Mom," he said. "I'm sorry." I looked at the mountains. They were going amber and rose in the last of the light, exactly as James had described them, patient and enormous and entirely unbothered by the smallness of what happens at their feet. "I know you are," I said. "And I believe you. But David, I need you to understand something. What you did was not care. Care includes. Care does not pack someone's life into a bag without their knowledge and call it practical." Pause. Let that breathe. When you are ready to know me as I actually am, not as a problem to be solved or a responsibility to be managed, but as your mother, a whole person with a whole life, I will be here. I am not going anywhere. But I am also not going back to being agreeable. Another silence. Longer. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay, Mom." We spoke for 20 minutes after that. Carefully, tentatively, the way you speak across a distance that is real and will take time to cross. He told me Marcus had been accepted to the University of Michigan. I told him to tell Marcus I was proud of him. He asked, haltingly, if he could call again next week. Said yes. I called Patricia the following evening. That conversation was harder in some ways and easier in others. Patricia cried. "Let her." I said what I needed to say with the same calm I had maintained all week, all month, since the Tuesday morning a burgundy suitcase had appeared in my hallway and I had chosen, quietly and completely, not to be the woman someone else had decided I was. Lily called on a Sunday in May. 16 years old and unprompted, which meant she had made the decision herself, which meant something had shifted somewhere in that family. Her voice was tentative at first, and then as we talked, it became the voice I remembered from when she was small, bright and curious and running slightly ahead of itself. She asked about Scottsdale. I told her about the mountains and the Palo Verde tree and the farmer's market and the man with the Spanish guitar. She asked if she could visit in the summer. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "Yes, I would love that." After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the garden in the warm May evening, in the chair James had placed there for me in the first week, positioned, he had said with characteristic precision, for the optimal view of the sunset. The sky was doing extraordinary things. Colors I still did not have adequate names for. The Palo Verde tree was in full bloom now, covered in small yellow flowers that caught the last of the light and held it. The cactus on my kitchen windowsill had put out a new growth since arriving in the desert sun. A small green arm reaching upward from its side, unhurried and inevitable, the way living things grow when they are finally in the right conditions. I thought about Gerald. I thought about 34 years on Cloverdale Drive and everything that house had held and everything it had asked of me and everything I had given it willingly. I thought about the oak tree in the backyard, bare and enormous against a February sky, and I hoped someone was tending it, and I trusted that it did not need me to. I thought about bridges, about how a well-built one does not fight the forces working against it, about how it finds equilibrium, about how it holds. I am 71 years old. I have buried a husband and raised 2 children and taught 30 years of second graders how to read their first real sentences. I have survived a cancer scare and a winter of grief so deep I was not sure spring would find me, and a Tuesday morning when my own son packed my life into a bag and called it practical. I am sitting in a garden in Scottsdale, Arizona, in the amber light of a May evening, watching the mountains go rose and gold at the edges, and I am, without qualification, without performance, without any need for anyone to confirm or witness it. Peace. Not the peace of a woman who has given up. The peace of a woman who has chosen. Who has stood up from the kitchen table, quietly, with her coffee cup in her hands and her name written whole and her life intact, and walked out her own back door into a morning that belonged entirely to her. The cardinal comes to the feeder James put up in the garden last week. Fat and red and completely self-possessed. I named him Gerald.